Welcome back, dear listener. You have traveled a long and magnificent road to arrive here. In part one, you learned what will truly is. It's three great phases of desire, decision, and action, and that deeper, ultimate will that is so closely bound to the core of the self that the two can barely be told apart. In part two, you saw what will can do. In the life of Bernard Palissy burning his furniture through the night, in the stubborn unconquerable persistence of Disraeli and Balzac and Audubon and all those great souls who refuse to be stopped, and in the quiet, extraordinary power of the subconscious will, waiting like a sealed casket to be opened. And now, in part three, we arrive at the part you've been building toward, how to develop it. Because everything Atkinson has shared up to this point has been preparation. The map has been drawn. The territory has been shown to you. The proof that the journey is worth making has been laid before you in story after story of lives transformed by a deliberately cultivated will. Now it is time for the work itself. In this final part, Atkinson turns practical. He gives us the actual methods for developing the imagination that feeds will, for cultivating the decision that shapes it, for training the volition that releases it into action. And then, in a chapter that serves as both mirror and warning, he shows us the 7 marks of the negative will, the qualities whose absence leaves a person, however talented and however well-intentioned, powerless to make their life into anything worthy of the self they carry within them. This is the part that changes things. Let's begin. How to develop imagination. Of all the faculties that feed and serve the will, perhaps none is more important or more consistently underestimated than the imagination. We tend to think of imagination as something decorative, something for artists and dreamers and children. Something pleasant but not particularly serious. A nice quality to have, but not one that has much to do with the hard practical business of building a life and accomplishing real things in the world. Atkinson would firmly disagree, and by the time he is finished making his case, you will too, because the imagination, properly understood and properly used, is the will's most powerful ally. It is a faculty by which we create the mental images that the will then uses as its patterns, its molds, its maps. Without a clear image of what we are reaching for, the will has no direction to move in. It presses its energy against the air. It burns without illuminating anything. It strains without building anything. But give the will a clear, vivid, precisely detailed mental image of what is to be achieved, and everything changes. The will now has something to move toward, a destination it can see, a pattern it can shape itself to. This is the first and most important function of the imagination in the service of will, to create clear and distinct mental images of the things we wish to do, become, or accomplish. Atkinson is specific about what this means in practice. He says, think of the things that you wish to do or become, and endeavor to see them as already existent in their smallest detail. So thoroughly familiar with every aspect of the ideal that it feels almost as real as the present moment, as solid and specific, and fully realized as something you have already lived through, because when you do this, when you hold a vivid, detailed, complete mental image of what you intend to create, something remarkable happens in the deeper architecture of the mind. You build what Atkinson calls a mental path, a well-worn groove in the territory of the mind, along which the will travels naturally and easily toward its destination. We are always building these mental paths, he says, consciously or unconsciously. Every time we dwell on something, we wear a path toward it. Every time we rehearse a fear, We wear a path toward the thing we fear. Every time we picture ourselves succeeding, we wear a path toward success. Every time we imagine ourselves failing, we wear a path toward failure. This is not metaphor. This is not poetry. This is the actual mechanical reality of how the mind works. The paths we wear in our mental landscape determine the directions I will tend to travel, and over time, those paths become so familiar, so deeply worn, so naturally easy to follow, that the will moves along them almost without effort, which means that the quality of our imagination, the content of the mental images we allow to occupy our minds, is one of the most practically consequential choices we make. And it is a choice. This is the crucial point. Atkinson is very clear that while we cannot always control what images arise in the mind spontaneously, we can absolutely choose, through the deliberate direction of attention, which images we dwell on, which we encourage, and which we refuse to entertain. The imagination, he says, takes its color from its environment, feed it images of courage and forward movement, and it develops a tendency to generate more images of that kind, which in turn create paths of the will in that direction. Feed it images of fear and limitation and habitual smallness, and it generates more of those, creating paths the will naturally tend to follow in exactly the wrong direction. But the selective power of attention, directed deliberately by the will itself, allows every person to choose their own mental environment, to curate, as it were, the internal landscape through which their will moves. And in the end, as Atkinson says, the will is supreme through its instrument of attention. Now, there is a second dimension to developing the imagination for the service of will, and it is equally important. It is the building of a personal ideal, a vivid, specific, richly imagined picture of the person you intend to become. Halleck expresses this beautifully when he writes that the young take no more important step than when they frame an ideal which they will ever strive to attain. The first step is to study the lives of illustrious people, to see what constitutes a noble and glorious life, to understand how obstacles are surmounted, how genuine eminence is gained. The next step is to select the most worthy attributes encountered in those lives and to embody them in a personal ideal, one that is peculiarly fitted to the constructor. Each of us, in other words, can build our own life chart. We can take the energy of Napoleon, the integrity of a Washington, the iron will of a Cromwell, the compassion of Howard, the inventive genius of an Edison, the determination of a blind Milton, who resolved to leave behind something worthy of himself that posterity would not willingly let die. And we can weave these qualities into a single guiding ideal, shaped to the particular contours of our own nature and our own circumstances. The youth whose imagination has never been fired by great deeds, Halleck says, will not amount to much, but the one who has fixed a high and specific ideal before the mind's eye, who carries that ideal as a kind of internal compass, that person has something to measure every day against, something to move toward with every choice, something that makes the direction a little clear even when the path ahead is not. Hitch your wagon to a star, Emerson said. That is exactly this. Not vague aspiration, not wishful feeling, but a specific, imagined, clearly held ideal that the imagination has made real enough to will toward. But here Atkinson pauses to issue a caution that is equally important, and it is a caution against one of the most seductive and most dangerous misuses of the imagination. He calls it idle daydreaming. The person who has developed their imagination to the point where the pictures it produces are vivid and beautiful and deeply satisfying. This person faces a particular danger. The danger of loving the dream more than the doing, of finding the inner world of mental picture making so rich and so pleasurable that the outer world of actual action seems by comparison flat and demanding and not worth the effort. Such a person, Atkinson says with characteristic directness, lives in a kind of mental intoxication. They are content with the fascinating work of pattern making, but they never use the patterns to shape anything real. They are enthralled with making molds, but they never pour molten wool into them and draw out actual objects. They see beautiful things in the quiet theater of the mind, but they never step out and make those beautiful things real in the world. And this, he says, is no better than any other form of intoxication. The talk of such people is a babbling of dreamers who have mistaken the dream for the life. Listen, he urges, and there is a sharpness and a warmth in his voice here. Listen to what the practical world is shouting in your ear. Wake up, you are still here on earth. Wake up and get to work. Be dreamers, but act out your dreams. Be planners, but carry out your plans. Do not go through life wearing the vacuous, ecstatic smile of the mere dreamer of dreams, living in a fool's paradise of an unrealized ideal. The imagination is not given to us as a substitute for action. It is given as a preparation for action, as a drawing of the blueprint before the building is built, as the forming of the mold before the casting is poured. Its full value is only realized when it takes the image it has created and drives it forward into the world as something actual, tangible, real. Dream fiercely, imagine vividly, but then act. How to develop decision. Between desire and action, between the fire of wanting and the release of doing, stands one of the most important and most neglected of all human capacities, the capacity for decision. Atkinson has already introduced us to decisive will in Part 1. That middle phase of will which weighs, judges, and chooses between competing desires and possible courses of action. But here, in this third part, he goes beyond simply describing it and gives us the practical means of developing it into a reliable, trustworthy faculty. Because decision left to itself is not reliable. Most people's decision-making is not, if they are honest with themselves, a genuinely rational process. Most people make their decisions first, driven by feeling, by impulse, by the momentum of desire in the moment, and then invent reasons for those decisions afterward. They use the intellect not to guide the will, but to excuse it. Not to deliberate, but to justify. Not to decide, but to rationalize. This is, Atkinson says, one of the most common and most costly of human mental habits. Consider how differently most of us approach advice giving versus decision making. When a friend comes to us with a problem, we are capable of remarkable objectivity. We think of all the arguments for and against. We weigh the possible consequences. We consider the long-term implications. We bring the full intelligence of a calm, disinterested mind to bear on the question, and arrive at a genuinely considered judgment. And then we walk away from that conversation and make our own equally important decisions entirely from feeling, barely consulting the same intelligence we just applied so usefully to someone else's situation. The development of decision requires, first and most fundamentally, the willingness to actually think, not to go through the motions of thought, not to manufacture the appearance of deliberation, while actually following impulse, but to genuinely engage the intellect in the work of weighing and comparing and testing and questioning. And thinking, Atkinson observes with honest directness, is not as easy as it sounds. People, as a rule, do not like to think in earnest. They are mentally lazy. They prefer to let other people think and decide for them. They accept the opinions and decisions of others and imagine that they themselves are thinking. They only think that they think. To think properly requires the exercise of attention under the direction of the will. And this is a circle of mutual dependence. Good decision requires genuine thought. Genuine thought requires sustained attention. Sustained attention requires will. And the exercise of will in this direction develops decision still further. Now, the raw material of good decision is perception and experience. You cannot make sound judgments about things you have not observed. You cannot weigh consequences you have never thought about. You cannot apply lessons you have never learned. This is why Atkinson urges every reader to develop the perceptive faculties, to take genuine notice of the world, of people, of the way things actually work, as opposed to the way novels and sensational entertainment suggest they work. Ask questions, relentlessly. The word why, applied persistently and honestly to whatever crosses your attention, is one of the most powerful instruments of developing the judgment. Why is this happening? What is this? Where does it come from? What is it for? What will be its consequences? Where will following this lead me? These questions, practiced until they become habitual, gradually build the storehouse of real, tested, experienced knowledge that good decision draws upon when it needs to choose. Halleck adds something particularly important about a specific and dangerous enemy of good decision, violent emotion. When feeling runs high, the time between impulse and action shrinks dangerously, and anger has escaped us before we were aware. A word has been spoken that we will regret for the rest of our lives before we could seem to apply the brakes. The only safeguard against these sudden emotional outbursts is to be continually watchful for the conditions that provoke them and have the habit of inhibition already half in place before the provocation actually arrives. Not to wait until the emotion is already at full flood and then try to hold it back, but to cultivate a standing readiness to pause, to breathe, to choose before the feeling carries us past the point of choosing. This habit, once formed, grows constantly easier. The first few times are the hardest, but the will that has learned to apply the brakes in moments of emotional urgency is a will that has passed one of its most important tests. And then, having deliberated, having genuinely thought, genuinely weighed, genuinely questioned, Atkinson gives us what may be the most important instruction in this entire chapter. It is practical, it is clear, and it has a kind of bracing force that every person who reads it feels immediately. Look before you leap. But when you leap, throw your entire will into the leap and forget what lies behind you. Be sure you are right, then go ahead. But when you go ahead, do all your worrying before action. When you act. The time for decision is before the act. When you get into the fight. Put your hand to the plow and look not backward. This is the full arc of developed decision. Genuine deliberation before the choice is made, and then complete, wholehearted, undivided commitment once the choice has been made. No looking back, no second guessing, no allowing of voices of hesitation and regret that were rightly excluded from the council chamber to creep back into the side door once the decision is already in motion. Look forward, not backward. Look upward, not downward. Look outward, not inward. And put on a full head of steam of will. How to develop volition. We have arrived now at the final phase of will in its active operation, the phase that Atkinson calls volition. And of all the phases he has described, this one is perhaps the most intimate, the most personal, and in many ways the most challenging to develop, because volition is not desire. It is not decision. It is that final, irreducible, essentially mysterious act of the self that pulls the trigger of action, that releases the spring of the will into actual, manifest doing in the world. Here is the critical distinction. A person may desire to act. They may even decide to act, and yet they still may not act. This is the great agonizing gap that so many intelligent, well-meaning, aspiring people fall into. The gap between knowing what to do and actually doing it, between deciding to move and actually moving, between the resolved intention and the released action. But there is a point when the will has been genuinely, fully exercised in its final phase, at which this gap closes, when a person truly wills the act in this final, complete sense. Atkinson says, they cannot refrain from action unless outside forces physically prevent it. True volition and action are inseparable. The spring, once released, must move. The development of volition requires us to understand something that cuts against the grain of how most people live. Most people act from the emotional plane. They do what they feel like doing. They follow the current of desire and feeling as it moves through them, and there was essentially a passenger in the vehicle of their moods and impulses, carried wherever those moods and impulses choose to go. The person of trained will does something fundamentally different. They learn to rise above the ordinary emotional plane and act from what Atkinson calls ahead, from a region of reason and deliberate choice, rather than from the region of feeling and impulse. They acquire the art of stepping aside from the emotional currents of the moment, as one would step aside from an overflowing river, and then reasoning out with calm, clear, steely intelligence what ought to be done, and then willing it, not because they feel like it, because their reason tells them they should. This, he says, is a distinguishing mark between the person of trained will and the ordinary person of feeling and desire, and it is not a mark that comes easily. The emotional self does not surrender its influence without a struggle. The desires and feelings press their claims again and again. Even when seemingly defeated in a particular moment, they return, sometimes within minutes, sometimes in new disguises, sometimes with fresh emotional arguments that seem perfectly reasonable in the heat of the moment. The most effective method of meeting this challenge is through habit. The cultivation of the habit of acting as reason dictates, rather than as feeling demands, until acting from reason becomes so natural, so practiced, so deeply worn into the structure of the mind that it requires no great effort at all. And Atkinson, drawing on the work of Professor William James, gives us a specific, practical, deceptively simple method by which this habit is built. Do things precisely because you would rather not. This is the great secret. Not complicated, not mysterious, not requiring any special equipment or unusual circumstances. Simply identify the things that your feeling self resists and do them regularly, deliberately, not because the things themselves matter in particular, though sometimes they do, but because the act of overriding the resistance, of choosing discomfort over comfort, of acting against the grain of the immediate desire, is the exercise that builds the will muscles in exactly the way physical exercise builds the body's muscles. Professor James suggests practices as simple as getting up and offering your seat when you would rather stay seated, speaking pleasantly when you feel otherwise, anything and everything that requires a decided effort of will in opposing the feelings and desires of the moment. He compares this practice to placing insurance on one's property, building up reserves of will strength for the critical moments when they will be urgently needed. One writer tells the story of a man who had declared a strong aversion to the dry material of political economy, and who was found by a friend poring intently over a volume of John Stuart Mill. His friend, clearly surprised, asked why. The man looked up and answered simply, "I am reading this because I dislike it." That man had found the secret of developing his will. Halleck adds to this with characteristic force. Nothing schools a will and renders it ready for effort in this complex world better than accustoming it to face disagreeable things. A will schooled in this way is always ready to respond, no matter how great the emergency. While another person is still lamenting the spilled milk, the possessor of such a will has already begun to milk another cow. When Napoleon found the Alps in his way, he scaled them. Another general would have been lamenting the obstruction. Napoleon had so thoroughly trained his will through the practice of doing necessary disagreeable things that what for others would have been the line of greatest resistance had become, for him, the line of least resistance. Habit and practice had worn away the original resistance, and to the doing of difficult, uncomfortable, demanding things was simply what he did. Automatically, naturally, without apparent struggle, and this transformation is available to every one of us, not through any special gift of nature, not through some mysterious endowment of character that only certain people are born with, but through the simple, patient, repeated practice of doing what reason dictates rather than what feeling demands. There is another method that belongs in the same family, and that is the practice of doing things now. Procrastination is one of the most reliable signs of undeveloped volition. The mind naturally prefers to defer uncomfortable or uninteresting tasks, to put them off, to let them sit, to find endless reasons why now is not quite the right moment. And every time we yield to this preference, we wear the path of avoidance a little deeper and make it a little harder to choose action the next time. But every time we override that preference, every time we do the thing now rather than later, regardless of how the feeling self responds to the demand, we wear a different path, a path toward immediate, decisive action. And eventually that path becomes so natural, so automatic, so much the default response, that the gap between the intention and the act narrows to almost nothing. The exercise of voluntary attention upon dry or uninteresting subjects serves the same purpose. Anyone can pay attention to something fascinating. It takes no will at all to be absorbed in something that naturally captivates the mind, but to place the attention deliberately upon something dry and hold it there by force of will. This is a genuinely rare faculty, and it is a faculty that separates the people who do things in the world from the people who entertain themselves with more interesting toys while the important work goes undone. Now, Atkinson wants to say something about the relationship between self-conquest and the ability to influence the world beyond the self. And it is a relationship that almost everyone gets backwards. Most people imagine that the will must first prove itself in some great outward arena, in business, in leadership, in some dramatic public contest of strength and skill, and that having proved itself there, it will then naturally extend its influence inward to govern the self. Atkinson says the opposite is true, and the great lives of history confirm it without exception. The conquest of the self must come first. The person who has not mastered the inner world, who cannot override their own feelings, cannot direct their own attention, cannot act consistently from reason rather than impulse, that person cannot exert a strong and lasting effect on anyone or anything outside themselves. The power flows outward from the inside, always, without exception. But the person who has done the work of self-conquest, who is built through patient practice and repeated effort, a will that acts from reason rather than feeling, that can face disagreeable things without flinching, that does not procrastinate or waver or cave to pressure of the moment. That person has developed a degree of willpower which, turned outward, accomplishes the same kind of miracle it has already accomplished within. The obstacles of the outer world, Atkinson says, are rarely harder to overcome than the rebellious faculties of your own mind. Master those, and the rest becomes largely a matter of determination, doggedness, persistence, and singleness of purpose. And he leaves us, in this chapter, with perhaps the most important single instruction in the entire book. Simple enough to say in 6 words. Deep enough to spend a lifetime practicing. Live in your head, not in the cries and demands of the lower planes of feeling and impulse, not in the noise and pressure of whatever the body or the emotions happen to be insisting upon in any given moment, but in the higher chamber of the mind, in the quiet, clear region of pure will and reasoned choice. Make your decisions from that inner chamber. Shut the door against all comers. Dwell for the time being in pure will, and then come forth with your mind made up and your decision firmly fixed. And always act according to the decision so made. Do not allow yourself to be sidetracked. See your goal and move straight toward it. Act not because you feel like it, but because your reason tells you that you should. And let the should with you always merge into the must. This is no easy task. Atkinson says so plainly, it is not for the weaklings of the race. It is for the strong ones. And then he asks, with a directness that reaches right through the page and the years and lands in the present moment with full force, to which class do you belong? To which class do you intend to belong in the future? What are you going to do about it? The choice is yours. As you answer, so shall you be. The will is there, awaiting your demand. Take it or leave it. The marks of the negative will. There is a kind of knowledge that comes not from looking at what we want to become, but from looking honestly at what we must avoid becoming. From studying not the ideal to be reached, but the failure to be recognized and corrected before it calcifies into permanent limitation. This is why Atkinson devotes an entire chapter, positioned deliberately near the end of this book, to what he calls the marks of the negative will, not to discourage us, not to condemn anyone, but to hold up a mirror with enough clarity and enough honesty that we can see, without flinching, where the enemies of our own development actually live, because the greatest danger is not the enemy we can see coming from a distance. It is the quiet, habitual, comfortable failure that we have lived with so long that we have stopped recognizing it as failure at all. There are 7 marks of the negative will. Let us look at each one with the clear eyes that Atkinson intends. The first mark is lack of perception. The person who lacks perception fails to see and know what is actually going on around them and in the world. Their awareness is narrow and petty, not because the world has nothing to offer, but because they have developed no habit of noticing it. They move through life like a sleepwalker, present in body, absent in mind, untouched by the extraordinary richness of information and opportunity in human reality that surrounds them every hour of every day. And here's the chain of consequence that Atkinson traces with devastating logic. Not seeing, they cannot think. Not thinking, they cannot use imagination properly. Not using imagination, their desires remain simply the inherited desires of the race, unexamined, undeveloped, unremarkable, and not having genuine, cultivated, personally owned desires. They cannot will. The world is full, he says with characteristic bluntness, of these human vegetables, cabbages in human form. Not cruel words, but honest ones, because the person without perception is not engaging with the life they have been given. They are merely occupying it. The cure begins with a single decision to start noticing, to look at what is actually around you, the people, the events, the patterns, the opportunities, the whole living, moving, speaking reality of the world, and to begin genuinely seeing it. The second mark is lack of aspiration. This is the absence of the upward drive, the emotive force that urges a person forward and onward, beyond where they are, toward what they might become. The person without aspiration has desires, but they are confined entirely to the animal level, comfort, ease, the satisfaction of immediate physical needs and wants. There is no reaching toward anything higher, no hunger for growth, no sense that there is a self worth developing into something more than what it presently is. Atkinson's description is sharp. Such a person chews a cud contemplatively and dreams of nothing at all. They cannot be said to live, in the true sense of the word. They exist, and their contentment, and they often are genuinely contented, is not the contentment of philosophical wisdom, not the peace of a person who has considered life deeply and made a deliberate choice to embrace simplicity. It is a contentment of inertia, of a creature that has never been awakened to what it might be, and has therefore never felt the absence of it. The third mark is lack of imagination. The person without imagination cannot look ahead, cannot picture things as they might be made to be, cannot see the step beyond the one immediately in front of them, cannot form a mental image of themselves as better, as more capable, as inhabiting a richer and more purposeful life. They are not necessarily happy about this. Atkinson is careful to note that lack of imagination does not always produce contentment. Often it produces the opposite, a vague, unfocused, diffuse discontent that cannot point to what it is missing, because it lacks the very faculty that would allow it to picture what is missing. They are, he says with a touch of gentle humor, human clams. And he adds, no doubt the clam is spared much discomfort by reason of its lack of imagination. But who wants to be a clam? Who? Indeed, excepting the clam, the imagination can be developed. This is a hopeful counterpoint to every negative mark in this chapter. The imagination responds to practice, to the deliberate choosing of the subjects and objects upon which we allow the mind to dwell, to the building of clear and specific ideals toward which the whole mental life is oriented. The fourth mark is lack of decision. We have already met this enemy in part 1. But here Atkinson shows us its full, lived, daily reality in a person's life. The person without decision may have desire, may even have aspiration and imagination, but they cannot make up their mind. They cannot choose. They are like a human tennis ball, batted back and forth between opposing motives, never coming to rest, like that philosopher's donkey, standing exactly equidistant between two equally attractive stacks of hay, unable to commit to either one, and therefore consuming neither and starving in the space between. They govern themselves by impulse, and since impulses are constantly changing direction, they never know where they stand. They are driftwood on the sea of life. They avoid deciding as long as possible, and when they can avoid it no longer, they hand the decision to someone else. The irresolute person, as an old saying has it, is lifted from one place to another, hatches nothing, and addles all their actions. And here Atkinson quotes words that carry the full force of urgency, words that deserve to be heard and held and acted upon without delay. For indecision brings its own delays, and days are lost lamenting over lost days. Are you in earnest? Seize is very minute, what you can do, or dream you can begin it. Boldness is genius, power and magic in it. Only engage, and then the mind grows heated. Begin, and then the work will be completed. These are not mere encouragements. They are descriptions of an actual psychological reality. The mind that engages, that commits, that begins, that steps off the bank into the current, discovers resources and momentum and clarity that the mind hesitating on the bank can never find. The engagement itself creates the conditions for its own completion, but it must begin. The fifth mark is lack of volition, and this is perhaps the most heartbreaking of the 7 marks, because the person who suffers from it may have all the other qualities in abundance. They may perceive clearly, aspire earnestly, imagine vividly, and even decide firmly, and yet they never actually act. They want to act. They are ready to act, but they never will to will. They never release the final spring. They stand perpetually on the threshold, fully equipped, fully oriented, fully decided, and yet never step through the door. This is the territory of procrastination in its deepest and most crippling form. And Atkinson shows us what it looks like at its most extreme. In the portrait of Coleridge, one of the most gifted minds of his era, a man who combined the reasoning powers of the philosopher with the imagination of the poet and the inspiration of the seer, who left upon subsequent generations one of the strongest imprints of any thinker of his time. And yet, as a writer on psychology observed, there was probably never a man endowed with such remarkable gifts who accomplished so little that was worthy of them. With numerous gigantic projects constantly floating in his mind, Coleridge never brought himself even seriously to attempt to execute any one of them. It used to be said of him that whenever either natural obligation or voluntary undertaking made it his duty to do anything, that fact alone seemed a sufficient reason for his not doing it. The waste of that life, the waste of all that extraordinary capacity, is almost painful to contemplate. And yet versions of this failure, less dramatic but no less real, play out every day in the lives of thousands of people who have more than enough talent and more than enough intelligence and more than enough desire, but have never learned to will. Halleck's diagnosis is precise. The easiest way to ruin a will is to allow emotions to evaporate without leading to action, to frame decisions and then not act on them. The will and the character are very speedily ruined in this way. Very speedily. A successful business person once divided all people into exactly 2 classes: those who did what they had promised or been directed to do, and those who returned with reasons why they had not done it. When hiring, this person set a hard task at the outset. Those who returned with reasons were dismissed. Those who returned with results were kept. Over time, this simple test built around them a remarkable group of people upon whom they could absolutely depend. This story is worth sitting with for a moment. Which class do you belong to? When you set yourself a task, when you promise yourself that something will be done, do you do it? Or do you return to yourself with reasons? Do it now is the antidote. 3 words, the simplest possible rule, and one of the most powerful acts of will training available to any human being. The 6th mark is lack of continuity. This is different from lack of perseverance, though the 2 can look similar from a distance. Atkinson is precise about the distinction, and it matters. Lack of continuity is not the desire to give up. It is a desire for change. The person who suffers from it has will. But it is a restless, wandering will that cannot stay fixed on one object long enough to complete it. They begin with enthusiasm and genuine commitment, but then the attention wanders, a new interest appears. The sense of novelty fades from the current task and blazes up around the next one, and the will follows the novelty, leaving the current project unfinished in its wake. Instability, fickleness, inconstancy, these are its names. And as Atkinson says, ruin more bright people than perhaps any other negative quality, because the person who suffers from it has genuine energy and genuine intelligence, but dissipates both in every direction instead of concentrating them on the chosen task. Concentration is power. Concentration is focus will. Continuity is the holding of the keen edge of the will against the one object to be shaped, for as long as it takes to shape it completely, and lack of continuity is dissipation of energy, the scattering of exactly the force that, properly focused, would be capable of remarkable things. Beware the lack of continuity. Atkinson says, it is a rotten speck on many a peach. The seventh mark is lack of perseverance. And here is where the distinction with lack of continuity becomes clear. The person who lacks continuity wants to change direction, to move the will to something new and different. But the person who lacks perseverance does not want to change direction. They simply want to stop. They are tired. The interest is faded not in favor of something else, but into nothing. The will is not being pulled elsewhere. It is simply running out of fuel. This is the lack of staying power. The failure of determination and persistence, not from restlessness, but from simple exhaustion of the inner drive. And the distinction matters because the cures are different. Lack of continuity arises largely from temperament, from a fundamental character tendency toward restlessness and novelty, and its correction requires a deeper shift in how a person relates to their own nature. But lack of perseverance arises from insufficient exercise of the will, from the simple fact that the will has not been practiced and developed enough to sustain effort through the difficult, dull, discouraging middle passages of any worthy endeavor. And for this, the cure is straightforward: exercise, practice, and patient work. The will, trained to the deliberate practice of facing disagreeable things and doing what reason dictates, gradually develops the capacity to sustain effort through the passages that would once have broken it. The line of greatest resistance becomes, through practice, the line of least resistance. And what once required everything we had requires, eventually very little at all. These 7 marks, lack of perception, aspiration, imagination, decision, volition, continuity, and perseverance, are the 7 faces of the negative will. And Atkinson's purpose in laying them before us so clearly is not to condemn, but to illuminate, because you cannot address what you cannot see. You cannot strengthen what you have not first located. You cannot build toward the positive will until you have honestly, clearly, without self-deception, identified where the negative will has been operating in your own life. Look in the mirror, not with cruelty, not with despair, but with the clear-eyed honesty of a person who has decided to do better and who now knows exactly where to begin. And so we arrive at the end of part 3, the end of this great 3-part journey through the will, its nature, its power, and its development. William Walker Atkinson set out to do something remarkable in this book, not to inspire us for an hour and then leave us where we started, not to show us how extraordinary other people's lives could be and then send us back to our ordinary ones. but to give us a complete, practical, honest, deeply considered guide to the single most transforming force available to any human being. The will. He has shown us what will is. Not one simple quality, but a living process, moving always from the heat of desire to the wisdom of decision into the release of action, and resting ultimately on that mysterious, irreducible, essentially personal ultimate will that is so close to the core of the self that the two can barely be distinguished. He has shown us what will does. In the lives of people who burned their furniture to keep the fire going, who rewrote destroyed manuscripts, who stood up after humiliation and declared that the time would come when the world would listen, and who made it so. He has shown us how to develop it, by tending the imagination like a carefully kept fire, by building the habit of genuine deliberation followed by complete commitment, by training the volition through the daily practice of doing what reason dictates rather than what feeling demands, and by meeting with clear, honest eyes the seven faces of the negative will, wherever they appear in our own lives. And underneath all of it, one message runs from the very first page to the very last. The will is already within you, not in someone else, not in the person you might someday become. In you, now, waiting. It is waiting for you to tend the fires of your highest desires, waiting for you to deliberate honestly and then decide completely, waiting for you to live in your head, in that higher chamber of pure will, and come forth with your mind made up and your direction clear, waiting for you to do the disagreeable thing now rather than later, waiting for you to hold on one moment longer than feels possible. The will is there. Atkinson says, awaiting your demand. Take it. If this recording has moved something in you, if these three parts have given you something real, something you can carry forward into the life you are building, please take a moment now to subscribe to our channel. Every subscription allows us to bring more of these timeless and transforming works to more people who need them. Subscribe. Share this with someone who is in the middle of a fight worth fighting. Tell them to keep going. And remember, as you go back into the world, into all of it, with everything it asks of you and everything it gives you and everything it takes, remember what Atkinson said. Grasp it like a person of metal, and it becomes soft as down. The will is there. It has always been there. It is yours. Go use it